In this session, I'm going to be finishing this short series on these Arthurian poems that we've been looking at, and in these conclusions, making some suggestions and some speculations, as always. I'm sure that those of you who've been following these last few weeks, you'll have tuned into where I'm going. And just in this last session, I just want to expand a little on this motif that we've been looking at. In the very first poem, the motif isn't present, but Arthur's relationship to death, speaking to the soul of his nephew, who has transmigrated into the form of an eagle. So Arthur's relationship to death in that sense, and also his relationship to the supernatural powers and how he relates to the supernatural powers is important. There's this sort of dialogue sort of form that we also find in not loads of dialogue, but it begins with dialogue, at least with the poem we looked at last week, What Man is the Porter? And it's only in the last two poems, in Prey the Anoven and What Man is the Porter, or Who is the Porter, Pagur, that we see this motif I've been trying to expand on, which is the idea of Arthur or some other nobleman turning up in front of a fortress and seeking entry to the fortress and having to have some interaction with the gatekeeper. And that interaction is usually very revealing as to the older mythology, perhaps, that sits behind this motif. And in this session, we're just going to fill that mythology out a little bit, and we're just going to speculate a little bit more about what it could mean. Just to summarise very briefly, in Prey the Anoven and Pa Ŵr Porthor, the last two poems we've looked at, there appears to be a significant role for death in these poems. Prey the Anoven really describes either a metaphorical attack on Anoven, on the fortress of Caer Sidi, which is given all these different fortress names, whether that's to try and gain entry into the supernatural realm, which would be very much in keeping when we consider other folks who have stolen magical animals, for example, from Anoven. We could also see this perhaps metaphorically as Arthur and Taliesin seeking entry for the souls of their fallen warriors. And this notion of seven returning being a description of reincarnation, perhaps. Only seven return from Caer Sidi. Only seven come back from Anoven, from the realm of immortals, from the fortress of immortals, let's say. That is, of course, speculation. Can't prove that. But the poem Pa Ŵr seems to back that up. What Man is the Porter, that poem from the Black Book of Carmarthen, suggests that Arthur is performing and declaiming these boasts so as to perhaps redeem his fallen warriors so that they can gain entry into this Valhalla-like fortress, this fortress of perpetual feasting and bliss, perhaps, where they can live on and they will never be forgotten, etc., etc. And I also alluded to this idea last week of Anoven perhaps being considered a realm of cultural memory, a realm of collective remembrance, if you like, that Anoven is somehow embedded in the Welsh nation's memory as a people of their fallen heroes, and their great sort of iconic figures are preserved as immortals in Anoven. We certainly find Taliesin, the embodiment of the Welsh bardic tradition, preserved as an immortal figure in Anoven, in this enchanted fortress, suggested many times in the poems from the Book of Taliesin. So the basic motif we're looking at is Arthur, or perhaps another character, an heroic character, seeking entry to the magical fortress, to the fortress of immortals. But there are other strands to this mythology. It's not just about the dead. As with many symbols in any mythology, we find that these symbols evoke many different types of meanings. So I often visualize the network of myth as this great web which is interwoven. So different symbols connect to each other in different ways. Some symbols will evoke certain themes, but when they're arranged in a different way, they'll evoke another theme. So, for example, we've been so far looking at this motif or this symbolic fortress or this symbolic dialogue with the gatekeeper as evoking this theme of death. But this very same motif, this very same symbolic image can evoke another mythological theme also, and that's what I'm just going to touch on in my concluding remarks. In Culhwch and Olwen, we find this very interesting episode. This is the part of the story where Arthur's men are off trying to accomplish all of these great feats that the giant Ysbyddaden has set Culhwch and Arthur's men. And they're off to get a very special sword. And Kai and a few of the other of Arthur's men are on the road, and they travelled that day until evening, until they saw a stone and mortar fort, the largest fort in the world. The largest fort in the world. Now, the most beautiful woman in the world is usually an archetypal woman, a sovereignty figure, usually in the very aristocratic mythology of the Welsh prose classics. Here, this is the largest fort in the world. So I would say that's a pretty strong hint that this is also a fantastical, mythological fort. Behold, they saw coming from the fort a black-haired man, bigger than 3 men of this world. The strong hint being that this man is of another world, and the fortress itself, therefore, the suggestion being, is of the other world. Arthur's men said to him, "Where do you come from, sir?" "From the fort you can see over there," said the big black giant. "Whose fort is it?" "You stupid men! There is no one in the world who does not know who owns this fort. It belongs to Wrnach Gawr." Now, if you remember from the poem last week, we saw in that poem there was a character called Afarnach. Well, perhaps this is the same character here. Afarnach is clearly a giant who's in a fortress, who is killed in the poem. In the Culhwch and Olwen story, it's Kai who is going to engage with this giant once again, as in the poem. It's Kai who's really the main character in the poem Pa Ŵr, What Man is the Porter? And here we find Kai in a relatively similar situation, not identical, but similar. "There is no one in the world who does not know who owns this fort. It belongs to Wrnach Gawr, Wrnach the giant." So we're very much in traditional Welsh Arthurian territory here. The opposition, the enemy, usually being a giant. "What customs are there regarding guests and travellers who arrive at this fort?" "Ah, Lord, may God protect you. No guest has ever left here alive." Now, this is the largest fortress in the world, and no one has ever left here alive. Is this a metaphorical description of the land of the dead? It is an otherworldly fortress, larger than anyone has ever seen, and no one ever leaves alive. There are some strong hints here, I'm sure you would agree. So death, again, is a very strong theme in this motif. But then it heads in another direction. Another theme is woven into this motif here. No guest has ever left here alive. No one is allowed inside except he who brings his craft. They made for the gate. Gwrhyr Gwalstawdieithoedd, one of Arthur's men who can speak all types of languages, said, "Is there a gatekeeper?" Yes, and as for you, may you lose your head for asking. So death again is evoked here. Now, we could just assume that this is actually standard procedure when approaching an unknown fortress. Fortresses are defensive positions, of course. They're defensive constructions. People are going to want to deny you entry on purpose, and they're going to try and threaten you. So it may not be peculiar or out of place to find this type of threat. Or it could chime with the death theme once again. May you lose your head for asking. Open the gate! I will not. Why won't you open it? Knife has gone into food and drink into horns, and a thronging in the hall of Ornach. Now, for those of you familiar with the story of Culhwch and Olwen, this of course echoes the previous episode where Culhwch is trying to gain entry to Arthur's court, and Glewlwyd Gafael Fawr, the gatekeeper, again in Culhwch and Olwen, the gatekeeper of Arthur's court this time, is essentially denying Culhwch entry because he's like, it's not a good time. They're all eating, they're all feasting. I'm not allowed to let anybody in. Of course, Culhwch has his own way of getting into the fortress, but you'll have to read the story if you want to find out what that is. So this is a repeating motif in the story. There are several gatekeepers described. Many of them are slaughtered by Culhwch and Arthur's men, but also Arthur himself has a gatekeeper. And here, this unknown gatekeeper here is taking part in a dialogue once again, just as we find in the poem from last week. Why won't you open it? Knife has gone into food and drink into horns, and a thronging in the hall of Ornach. Except for a craftsman who brings his craft, it will not be opened again tonight. Kai said, Gatekeeper, I have a craft. What craft do you have? Asked the gatekeeper. I am the best furbisher of swords in the world. And the gatekeeper responds, I shall go and tell that to Ornach Gawr and bring you an answer. Now, of course, this gives Kai entry into the fortress. Ornach Gawr wants someone to come and polish his sword for him and to sort of repair his scabbard and all the things that furbishers would do with swords. So Kai gains entry, but his mates don't. Now, of course, Kai gains entry to the fortress on the pretense that he's going to polish this sword, but he actually kills Ornach with the sword and, surprise, surprise, chops his head off. Many giants lose their heads in the story of Culhwch and Olwen, Ysbyddaden being the very obvious example. But Ornach here, Ornach the giant, his head being cut off with his own sword. So there is death again, but Kai doesn't die in the fortress. So that's really where this mythological theme breaks down, because there is death in the fortress, but it's not Kai's death. So that suggests to me that the storyteller may be aware of the tradition of these fortresses being associated with some type of death, but that the mythology isn't being evoked explicitly here. Now, the other theme that's being evoked here, of course, is craft and skill. That you need to be worthy to gain entry into this special fortress. You need to be worthy to gain entry into this supernatural fortress. When we look at poems from the book of Taliesin, Taliesin is naturally worthy and of high status and able and talented enough to gain entry to Caercythi, to the enchanted fortress, as are several other characters from the Celtic tradition. And I won't be the first and I won't be the last to point out that there is actually a great degree of similarity between the underlying story, the basic structure of Culhwch and Olwen, and the Second Battle of Moytura. And just to look at the Second Battle of Moytura very quickly, we're just going to look at a translation of this medieval story. This is from the Whitley-Stokes translation from the Revue Celtique. You can actually find an electronic version of this through the very useful Celt website. This episode of the story essentially features Lugh or Luch, and Lugh has arrived at Tara, at the great fortress, almost like the temple sort of fortress or the temple-like palace of the High Kings of Ireland, and he seeks entry. And the gatekeeper essentially says the same thing to Lugh in this story as the gatekeeper says to Kai in Cilwch and Dalwen, that being, you can gain entry, but do you have a craft or a skill that we need? And Lugh, of course, is he's Samil Danach. He has many skills. He has many abilities and crafts. And Lugh starts listing off his skills and his crafts. And he says, well, I'm a great metalsmith. And the gatekeeper says, we've got a metalsmith. We don't need a metalsmith. Lugh says, well, I'm a great poet and historian. The gatekeeper says, we've got a great poet and historian. We don't need you. Go away. And then Lugh says, well, I'm also a great harper. And the gatekeeper says, pah, we've got the finest harper in Ireland. Why do we need you? And so on until Lugh essentially says, well, I'm a master of all of these crafts. And Lugh said again, ask the king, said he, whether he has a single man who possesses all these arts, and if he has, I will not enter Tara. Then the doorkeeper went into the palace and declared all to the king. A warrior has come before the gate, saith he. His name is Samil Danach, and all the arts which thy household practice he alone possesses, so that he is the man of each and every art. This he, the king, said then, that the chessboards of Tara should be fetched to him, Samil Danach, and he won all the stakes, so they challenge him to all these games of chess, and he wins. Then that was related to Nuada, the king. And Nuada says, let him into the garth, let him into the gate, into the first part of the fortress, says Nuada. For never before has man like him entered this fortress. Then the doorkeeper lets Lugh pass him, and he entered the fortress and sat down in the sage's seat, for he was a sage in every art. And of course, Lugh goes on to have a great battle, the second battle of Moitura, and there's a giant as well with a big eye, Balor of the evil eye, and this giant is also killed by having something thrown into his eye, pretty much the same as we find in Cilwch and Dalwen. So there's clearly either an older storytelling tradition that sits behind both stories, or there's been some cross-cultural influence there. Difficult to say which one. Regardless, what we have here in this idea of these crafts being essential to the young nobleman gaining entry appears to me as some type of initiation, that these young noblemen have to prove themselves before they are worthy of gaining entry into the special place. Now, of course, the basic dynamic here is very hierarchical. There is the fortress, the high place, the special place, the defended place on top of the hill, where we can imagine the patriarchs are. The fathers of the community are up there, and they're all talented and learned and wise men, and they do amazing stuff and perform amazing feats, and they're all brave and etc., etc. And the young nobleman seeks entry to that high place, which is of course symbolic of climbing up the social hierarchy, proving oneself. It's interesting, though, that these Celtic stories see these crafts as proof of nobility, that the skill, the practice, the dedication to high standards of workmanship are seen as an aspect of nobility. Just as we find in the third branch of the Mabinogi, of course, with Manawydan, that there is something noble about dedicating oneself, humbling oneself to skills, to crafts. And this appears to be something that's essential to the nobleman to gain entry into the special place. Now, we can see in a sociological sense here that this is almost certainly how social class worked in not only in Celtic societies, but many different cultures and nations across the world. That there is a need to ascend up the social ladder, yeah? You need to prove yourself before you're allowed into the special place in the company of the special men. And there appears to be something important about proving your learning and proving your ability. And we can see that sociological explanation there also informs our mythological explanation. So crafts, hierarchy, proving oneself, learning, social value is part of the sociological interpretation. Death, proving oneself worthy of being an embodiment of the heroic ideal in the mythological sense, is also related. It's all about value, it's all about worth, it's all about being worthy, gaining entry into the realm of the dead to be remembered through your great feats. Arthur boasting at the gates of Valhalla, if you like, to prove that his warriors are worthy of gaining entry. We can see that this is a very hierarchical and male mythology here, about young men proving their worth. It's really about the conditioning of culture so as to ensure these very valuable standards and crafts and knowledge are preserved, that young men want to learn them. They want to be part of these communities of learning. They want to excel. They want to be experts, yeah? We can see how it really feeds into this idea of young people in general, not just young men, but young folk in general wanting to prove themselves, wanting to prove their value, wanting to leave a mark on the world. Which brings us around again to this idea of these fortresses also being places of memory. These are the places where the crafts are excelled at and these crafts are preserved. The high standards of craft, the high standards of learning and knowledge are preserved in these citadels, these high places of great bravery and honour. Yeah, there's great dignity in these places, and that dignity is part of the effect of this knowledge, of this learning, which has a lot to say, I think, about these oral cultures. In cultures where learning was memorized, where learning was embodied, where learning wasn't something that was necessarily recorded outside of the human body, as in a manuscript. That was the case, of course, in the medieval period, or we wouldn't have these stories. But they're harking back to a culture where that wasn't the case, where there was no writing, and where all of culture was preserved in memory. So for me, these fortresses are not just fortresses of death. They're not just fortresses of initiation, of learning, but they're fortresses in a more general sense of memory, of cultural memory. It's as if everything is preserved there, that these are places where things will last. Now, of course, we can look at many different variations of this motif and find that they do very, very different things. That episode, for example, with Kai, killing Ornach the giant, doesn't look like that fortress in particular in that story is necessarily a place where high moral standards are preserved and maintained and memorised. But Arthur's court in Cilwch and Olwen does look like that. If you remember in Cilwch and Olwen, Cilwch evokes all of the great heroes and all of the great nobles of Arthur's court, in Arthur's court. And as he's doing that, he's evoking all of their different attributes and qualities. He's evoking the cultural memory that is embodied in these quite archetypal figures in the story of Cilwch and Olwen. So it is there in Cilwch and Olwen, just not that explicit. It's not in every court, in every fortress, but it is in Arthur's court, I would argue.